11 engines on the Saturn V? Wait, are you sure about that? What if I were to tell you there were actually 39 engines and/or rocket motors on the Saturn V rocket? Well, stick around. I will explain everything on the next Vintage Retrospect. Hello, I am Chad, and welcome to Vintage Retrospect, a nostalgic corner for me to talk about all things vintage space. And yes, it's time to finally talk about the Saturn V, and more specifically, that this mega rocket had a lot more than just 11 liquid-fueled engines powering and supporting this complex machine. Let's start with the first stage of the Saturn V. To begin, I have a handy-dandy Saturn V here to help guide us through this. So let's start with the first stage, which is this section right here of the Saturn V. This stage, which had its fuel tanks and engines, was also called the S1 stage. And this was ultimately powered by 5 massive F1 engines using liquid kerosene and liquid oxygen as its fuels. The combined thrust of these F1 engines provided an astounding 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The first stage would burn for about 2.5 minutes, and then the separation of the first stage and the beginning of the lighting sequence of the second stage would start to begin. But wait, the first stage just didn't fall away gracefully. It had 8 small retro rocket motors using solid propellant to help break away this first stage separation. This helps clear the gap since there is still some kinetic energy left over from the F1 engines. So the second stage, called S2 for short, has a power plant of 5 J2 engines. But before these 5 J2 engines can fire up, there needed to be a way for the fuel to slosh backwards to reach the engines, since the F1 engine cutoff eliminated any sort of acceleration. So 8 ullage motors on the S2 stage would fire just after the first stage separation, giving the rocket a slight boost, which helps the fuel feed into the engines for ignition. The 5 J2 engines were powered by a different fuel mixture, which was liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Just shortly after ignition of the second stage, there was no need for the launch abort tower, which is this section right up here, and is attached to the command and service module stack of the Saturn V, which of course was on the very top. As simple as that. The tower jettisons away using 4 rocket motors, but with the nozzles aimed in such a non-symmetrical way that the tower is able to clear the rocket's trajectory. So we wouldn't want to bump back into that tower and cause another "Houston, we have a problem," would we? Now the second stage burned for several minutes, and when it came time for separation, like the stage before it, 4 retro separation motors fired, pulling the S2 stage back, leaving room for the third stage, called the S4B stage, to take over ascent into suborbital trajectories. Now this third stage had 2 ullage motors and then 2 APS flight packs to both help with the firing of the engines. The weird thing here is the APS, also known as the auxiliary propulsion system, which had reaction control thrusters built in as well to help with attitude control. This is because the J2 engines needed to be relit for its translunar injection burn, which of course requires a rocket to reorient itself in the direction where it needs to be fired to ultimately set the rest of the Saturn V stack on a course to lunar capture. Don't forget that these 4 motors on the third stage will also have to fire again to produce the ullage, because anytime the rocket stops accelerating, that fuel will slosh around due to the reduced gravity. So there you have it, 39 total, which consists of liquid fuel engines and solid rocket motors. I do want to extend an honorable mention here where the entire Saturn V stack, including the spacecraft stack, had a grand total of 83 engines. In other words, it took 83 engines to get through the moon. That is some perspective in engineering. Don't forget to subscribe and like this content so that people who thought the Saturn V only had 11 engines can also learn that this rocket was so complex that it had almost triple the amount of engines, and to appreciate the old school engineering it took to get this legendary beast off the ground. And don't forget to find me on Orbital Edge News, where it's all things modern space and where we have fun discussion on engaging space topics. I am your host, Chad, and I will see you out on the launch pad.